Marble Madness is a fast-paced, arcade-style puzzle platformer where players control a marble and navigate it through a series of increasingly difficult obstacle courses. The goal is to reach the end of each course before time runs out, while avoiding various hazards and enemies. The game is renowned for its use of physics and pseudo 3D graphics, which were revolutionary at the time of its arcade release. The marble moves with realistic momentum and inertia, meaning players need to be mindful of how fast the marble is rolling and how sharp they turn. Precision control is key, as the marble can fall off ledges, bounce unpredictably, or be knocked off course. Levels are populated with various obstacles, such as marble-eating enemies, disappearing platforms, ramps, chutes, and narrow pathways. Later levels also introduce more complex hazards, such as moving platforms and enemy marbles that try to knock the player off course. Marble Madness was originally designed by Mark Cerny, who was only 18 years old at the time. He envisioned a game that used the trackball controller to create a unique blend of action and puzzle solving. The Sega Mega Drive version was one of many ports that appeared after the game's original success in arcades. Other home versions appeared on systems like the NES, Amiga, and Game Boy. While the Mega Drive version was considered one of the better home adaptations, it lacked some of the tactile feel of the arcade's trackball controls. Sega had to adapt the game's mechanics for the home console D-pad, which was a significant challenge. While the port is faithful, the precision required in some levels can make the game feel a bit more difficult without the original trackball controller. One of the key challenges in development was balancing the difficulty. Marble Madness was known for being tough, especially as the levels became more complex with tighter time limits and harder obstacles. Finding the right balance between challenge and fun was a critical part of the game's design process. Cerny and his team had to tweak level designs and the physics engine to ensure that the game felt fair, while still providing a steep learning curve for players to master. When Marble Madness was ported to the Sega Mega Drive, the development team faced several challenges in translating the arcade experience to a home console. One of the primary challenges was replacing the arcade's trackball controls with the Mega Drive's D-pad. The trackball provided very precise control over the marble's movement, and replicating that precision with a D-pad was difficult. As a result, some players found the Mega Drive version harder to control. The marble's physics didn't translate perfectly from the arcade version to the Mega Drive, and some players noticed inconsistencies in how the marble responded to slopes and obstacles. For example, the momentum felt slightly different, and the marble could occasionally behave unpredictably, especially when moving at high speeds or near edges. This wasn't necessarily a bug, but it reflected the difficulty in translating the arcade experience to a home console. Some players noted that collision detection with certain objects or enemies could feel slightly off in the Mega Drive version. Occasionally, the marble would seem to get stuck in places or interact strangely with objects, though this wasn't widespread or game-breaking. The arcade game's physics engine was more sophisticated, and some of these issues arose from the limitations of porting the game. The Mega Drive version of Marble Madness experienced occasional slowdowns when there were too many elements on the screen at once, especially in later levels where enemies and moving platforms became more complex. This slowdown wasn't severe but was noticeable during moments of high activity. Again, this was a technical limitation rather than a bug, but it impacted the overall experience. The original arcade version of Marble Madness, released in 1984, was quite successful and became a classic in its own right. Its unique physics-based gameplay and innovative use of the trackball controller helped it stand out in arcades. Due to its success in the arcade, Marble Madness was quickly ported to several home platforms, including the NES, Amiga, Atari ST, and later the Sega Mega Drive for Genesis. The Sega Mega Drive for Genesis version of Marble Madness was released in 1991, 7 years after the arcade debut. At this point, the game was already a known quantity, and many retro gaming fans were familiar with it from the arcades or other home console ports. The game's relatively short length, only 6 levels, and arcade origins may have limited its appeal compared to other, more feature-rich titles on the system. However, it likely attracted players who were either nostalgic for the arcade experience or looking for a challenging, physics-based puzzle game. Exact sales figures for the Sega Mega Drive version are not widely available, making it difficult to determine the game's overall commercial performance on that platform. The game didn't achieve the same blockbuster success as some of Sega's bigger hits like Sonic the Hedgehog or Streets of Rage, but it still found a niche audience.